I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would betray her husband. I never thought I'd let myself get lost in the chaos of infidelity, but here I am, sitting in the middle of our kitchen, staring blankly at the ring on my finger, barely holding back tears. My heart is pounding, my mind a tangled mess of guilt and regret.
I don't know how it came to this.
Or maybe I do. It all started so innocently. Doesn't it always? You tell yourself that the friendly conversations, the little jokes, the smiles that linger just a bit too long, are harmless. And at first they are. I wasn't looking for anything outside my marriage. I love Jack. I still do. We've been together for 7 years, married for 5. He's the kind of man who's steady, reliable, and I always felt safe with him. But somewhere along the way, things got too comfortable. The excitement, the thrill, it faded. We became more like roommates than lovers, and I felt myself drifting. He never noticed. Or maybe he did, but didn't know how to bring me back.
It was at work where I met David.
He was different. Confident, charming, with this infectious energy that drew people in. He wasn't even particularly handsome in the traditional sense, but there was something about him that I couldn't ignore. At first, our conversations were strictly professional. He worked in another department, and we would occasionally cross paths in meetings or at the coffee machine. But then he started complimenting me, subtle at first, a comment on my outfit or the way I handled a project. I didn't think much of it. It felt good to be noticed. Jack, bless him, was always so focused on his work, his routines. He rarely looked at me the way David did. I convinced myself that I was just enjoying a bit of harmless attention. But then came the day when harmless turned into something else entirely. It was a Friday evening, and we had an office party. Everyone was there, drinking, laughing, letting loose after a long week. Jack couldn't make it. He had a late work call, as usual, so I went alone. David was there too. We ended up talking more than usual, and the drinks kept flowing. I remember laughing at something he said, feeling lighter than I had in months. And then he touched my arm, just briefly, but it sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. It was innocent, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. But as the night wore on, we found ourselves standing outside the bar, away from everyone else. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken attraction that had been building for weeks. I knew I should walk away. I knew I should get in a cab and go home to Jack. But I didn't. Instead, I let David pull me into him, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was urgent, desperate. I should have stopped it. I should have pushed him away. But I didn't. I kissed him back. That kiss turned into something more, something I can't take back. We ended up at his place, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. It was reckless and wrong, and yet in that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't thinking about the consequences, about Jack, about how this would shatter everything we had built. All I cared about was the way David made me feel, desired, needed, alive. When I woke up the next morning, the reality of what I had done hit me like a tidal wave. I felt sick, disgusted with myself. I couldn't look at David, couldn't bear the thought of facing Jack. I left his apartment without a word, my mind racing with guilt and shame. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confess everything to Jack, to come clean and beg for his forgiveness. But another part of me was terrified. What if he couldn't forgive me? What if this was the end of us? For days, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time Jack looked at me, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my secret. He noticed something was off, of course he did. He asked me if I was okay, if something was wrong, but I just shook my head and forced a smile. How could I tell him the truth? How could I admit that I had betrayed him? I'm living with this guilt, and it's eating me alive. Every time I see David at work, it's like a knife twisting in my gut. I want to go back, to undo it all, but I can't. I made my choice, and now I have to live with the consequences. I still love Jack. I love him so much it hurts. But I don't know how to fix this.
I don't know if I can.
And as I sit here, staring at the ring on my finger, I wonder if I've already lost everything. The days after that night felt like a blur. Time passed, but I was stuck, frozen in that moment where I made the decision to betray the man I vowed to be faithful to for the rest of my life. Every morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest, the weight of my secret pressing down on me like an iron hand. I tried to go through the motions, getting up, making coffee, kissing Jack on the cheek as he left for work, but everything felt hollow, like I was performing a role I no longer believed in. Jack seemed oblivious, though I wasn't sure if it was because he genuinely didn't notice or if he was choosing not to see the change in me. He was so caught up in his work, his own world, that I often wondered if he even knew who I really was anymore. Or maybe I was just looking for excuses, trying to shift the blame onto him, so I wouldn't have to face the ugly truth of what I'd done. David. God, David was always there. At work, in my head, even in my dreams. Every time I saw him in the office, it was like a physical ache. Part of me wanted to run to him, to feel that thrill again, that spark that had ignited something in me that had long been dormant. But the other part of me, the part that was still clinging desperately to the life I had with Jack, wanted to disappear, to erase that night from existence and pretend like it never happened. He didn't make it easy, though. David was persistent. After that night, he started texting me. At first, it was casual, just work-related questions or comments. But then it turned into something more, something that made my pulse quicken every time my phone buzzed with a message from him. Can't stop thinking about you. That night was incredible. I need to see you again. I should have blocked him. I should have told him that it was a mistake, that it could never happen again. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself texting back, falling deeper into something I knew was wrong but couldn't seem to pull myself out of. It was intoxicating, the attention, the excitement. It was everything I hadn't felt in years. Jack loved me. I knew that, but our relationship had become so routine. Predictable. I hated myself for feeling this way, for craving something more, something I should have been getting from my husband but wasn't. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the night with David, I found myself sitting in my car outside his apartment. I didn't know how I ended up there. Maybe I had driven there on autopilot, or maybe some part of me had been leading me back to him all along. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I knew I shouldn't go in. I knew that if I walked through that door, I would be crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But the pull was too strong. I was weak. Before I knew it, I was standing outside his apartment door, my heart hammering in my chest. When he opened the door, he smiled, that same confident, easy smile that had drawn me to him in the first place. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He just stepped aside and I walked in. The moment the door closed behind me, he was on me, his hands pulling me toward him, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was hungry, desperate. This time, there was no hesitation, no guilt, no second thoughts. I gave in completely. We ended up in his bed again, just like that first night. It was the same rush of adrenaline, the same feeling of being alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But when it was over, the guilt came crashing down on me harder than before. As I lay there next to him, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I was in too deep. I got up, dressed quickly, and left without a word. This time, David didn't stop me. He didn't say anything, just watched me go with a look I couldn't quite read. When I got home that night, Jack was sitting on the couch, waiting for me. He smiled when I walked in, completely unaware of where I had been, of what I had just done. He patted the seat next to him, gesturing for me to sit. I sat down, my heart pounding, my stomach in knots. Jack reached over and took my hand in his, squeezing it gently. I felt a lump form in my throat as I looked at him, this man who had given me everything, and I felt like the worst person in the world. I've been thinking, he said, his voice soft, about us, about how we've been kind of drifting apart lately. My breath caught in my throat. He had noticed. All this time, I thought he was oblivious, wrapped up in his own world, but he had seen it. He had felt the distance between us too. I want to fix it, he continued. I miss you, Claire. I miss us. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. How could I fix this when I had already destroyed everything? How could I tell him the truth? I love you, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm sorry if I haven't been there for you the way I should have been. But I want to change that. I want to make things right. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down my cheeks as I nodded, unable to speak. Jack pulled me into his arms, and I let him hold me, sobbing into his chest, feeling like the worst kind of liar. That night, I lay in bed next to him, staring at the ceiling, wide awake while he slept soundly beside me. The guilt was suffocating, but I didn't know how to fix it. Telling Jack the truth would destroy him, would destroy us. But living with this secret was tearing me apart. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I wouldn't see David again, that I would focus on my marriage and do everything I could to make it right. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next few weeks felt like a delicate balancing act, one that I wasn't sure I could keep up for long. Jack, true to his word, started making more of an effort. He came home earlier, suggested we spend more time together, dinner dates, weekend hikes, even just quiet evenings on the couch watching movies. At first, it felt strange, almost forced, like we were pretending to be a version of ourselves from years ago, trying to recapture something that had slipped away without us noticing. But slowly, things between us began to feel more real. I saw flashes of the man I'd fallen in love with, the way he'd make me laugh with his dry humor, the quiet moments when he'd reach for my hand without saying anything, just to remind me he was there. It should have been enough. It should have been everything I wanted. And yet, every time I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe we could fix what had broken, David's presence lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. I tried to avoid him at work, avoiding the break room, taking different routes to my desk, even rescheduling meetings where I knew he'd be present. But David wasn't the kind of man to be ignored. The texts didn't stop. Every few days, my phone would buzz with a message from him, short and to the point, but enough to send my heart racing. Miss you. When can I see you? I deleted the messages as soon as they came in, but the guilt gnawed at me. I was living two lives. One where I was the wife trying to mend a marriage, and another where I was the woman still caught in the pull of an affair that hadn't fully burned out. I told myself I wouldn't see him again. I promised myself that what happened with David had to stay in the past. But the lies I was telling myself were as constant as the ones I told Jack. One evening, Jack and I were having dinner at home, just the two of us. He'd made spaghetti, his signature dish, and was in an unusually good mood, telling me about something funny that had happened at work. I smiled, nodded, tried to engage, but my mind was elsewhere. I could feel my phone buzzing in my pocket, and I knew who it was without looking. "Hey, you okay?" Jack asked, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "You've seemed distracted lately." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I wasn't sure how to answer. I could feel the weight of my phone against my thigh, the unanswered messages piling up. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired, I guess. Work's been stressful." Jack nodded, accepting my explanation without question, and went back to eating. But I could feel the distance between us, a distance that I had put there, and it scared me. After dinner, Jack went upstairs to take a shower, and I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes. My phone was burning a hole in my pocket, and finally, I couldn't resist. I pulled it out and checked the message. "I can't stop thinking about you.
Can we talk?
Please, David." I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the message and turned off my phone, but instead, I stood there, staring at the words, feeling the familiar pull, the craving for something I couldn't seem to let go of. My hands were trembling as I typed back. "We can't do this anymore." I stared at the screen, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. A few seconds later, the reply came. "Can you come over? Just to talk." My stomach twisted in knots. I knew what he really meant, and deep down I knew that if I went, it wouldn't just be to talk. But I also knew that I was losing control of the situation, of myself. I was in too deep, and I didn't know how to pull myself out. I glanced at the clock. Jack would be in the shower for a while, probably another 20 minutes at least. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my keys and quietly slipped out the back door. The drive to David's apartment was a blur. I barely registered the streetlights, the traffic, the world around me. All I could think about was what I was doing, betraying Jack all over again, even after everything he had done to try to make things right. But I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was on autopilot, being pulled towards something I couldn't control. When I arrived, David was waiting for me at the door.
He didn't smile this time.
His expression was serious, intense, like he knew this was different from the times before. "I shouldn't be here," I said as I stepped inside, my voice barely above a whisper. "But you are," he replied, closing the door behind me. His voice was low, almost a growl, and the sound of it sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there in the middle of his living room, feeling the weight of my decision press down on me. David walked toward me, slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on mine. I wanted to tell him to stop, to turn around and leave before I made another mistake, but the words wouldn't come. "You don't have to pretend with me, Claire," he said softly, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face. "I know what you're feeling. I feel it too." His words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy with unspoken desire. And in that moment, I hated myself for wanting him. I hated myself for the way my body responded to his touch, the way my heart raced in my chest even though I knew this was wrong. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to Jack." David's hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt my resolve slipping away. "Then leave him," he said, his lips inches from mine. "Be with me." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words crashing over me like a wave. Leave Jack. The thought was terrifying, unthinkable. Jack was my husband, the man I had built a life with, the man who loved me even though I had betrayed him. But David made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't felt in years. And that pull, that intoxicating pull, was stronger than anything I had ever experienced. "I don't know what to do," I confessed, my voice barely audible. David didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Instead, he kissed me, softly at first, then with more urgency, more need. And just like before, I gave in. I let myself get lost in the moment, in the heat of his touch, the way he made me forget everything except the fire that burned between us. We ended up in his bedroom again, tangled in sheets. Our bodies moving together like this was the only thing that made sense in a world that had become too complicated, too messy. Afterward, as I lay there next to him, my skin still flushed from the heat of our lovemaking, the guilt came crashing down again, heavier than before. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep living two lives, lying to Jack, lying to myself. But the thought of walking away from David felt impossible too. "I can't keep doing this," I said again, my voice shaky. "I can't." David rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow as he looked down at me. "Then don't," he said simply. "Leave him. We can be together, Claire. For real." I stared up at him, my mind spinning. Leave Jack. The thought terrified me, but the more I thought about it, the more it started to feel like the only way out. I couldn't keep lying, couldn't keep sneaking around behind his back. If I stayed, I would destroy him. But if I left, what then? "I don't know," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I just don't know." David leaned down and kissed me softly on the forehead. "You'll figure it out," he said. "I'll be here when you do." I stayed there for a while longer, lying next to him in the dark, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't untangle. Eventually, I got up, dressed, and left his apartment, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had just done. Again, when I got home, the house was quiet. Jack was already asleep, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside me. I lay down next to him, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of guilt, desire, and confusion. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know if I even could. All I knew was that I was on the edge of something that would change everything, no matter what I decided. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss. Every morning, I woke up next to Jack, feeling the weight of the lies I was living. He would smile at me, unaware of the storm raging inside me, and I would force myself to smile back. But my heart wasn't in it. How could it be when I was split in two? At work, I avoided David as much as I could, but it was impossible to avoid him completely. Every time I saw him, every glance we exchanged, it was like a physical reminder of everything I had done. He didn't push, didn't send any more texts, but the silence between us was charged with tension. It was as if he was waiting, giving me space to make my decision, but I knew that eventually, the pressure would become too much. I was trapped in this awful limbo. Every day, I told myself I needed to make a choice. I couldn't keep living this way. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make up my mind. The idea of leaving Jack felt like ripping my life apart. He was my husband, the man I had promised to spend forever with. We had built a life together, a home, shared dreams, shared memories. How could I throw all of that away? But then there was David. The thought of him made my pulse race, made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't in so long. It wasn't just about the physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. He made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. With Jack, I felt invisible sometimes, like we were just going through the motions of marriage. But with David, I was seen. I was desired. The internal war I was waging was tearing me apart. I could feel myself unraveling a little more every day. Jack noticed. Of course he did. One night, as we were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV show, he turned to me with a serious expression. "Claire, what's going on?" he asked softly. "You've been distant. I can feel it. Is there something you're not telling me?" My heart clenched painfully in my chest. This was it. This was my chance to come clean, to tell him everything. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. I looked into his eyes, and all I could see was the devastation that would follow if I told him the truth. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to have his world shattered because of my mistakes. "I'm just stressed," I finally said, my voice sounding weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Work has been crazy lately." Jack's eyes searched my face, and for a moment, I thought he didn't believe me. But then he sighed and leaned back on the couch, his hand reaching for mine. He gave it a gentle squeeze. "Okay," he said, though there was an undercurrent of doubt in his voice. "But you can talk to me, Claire, about anything. You know that, right?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know." That night, I lay awake in bed again, my mind racing. I felt sick with guilt. Jack was trying so hard, and I was betraying him, over and over again. I couldn't keep doing this. Something had to give. The next morning, I made a decision. I would end things with David. I had to. There was no other option if I wanted to salvage any part of my marriage. Jack deserved better, and I couldn't live with myself if I kept hurting him like this. I sent David a text before I left for work. "We need to talk. I'm coming over tonight." The day dragged by in a haze of anxiety and dread. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it twisted my stomach into knots. How would David react? Would he try to convince me to stay? Would he let me go? By the time I pulled up to his apartment that evening, my hands were shaking. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the door, trying to summon the courage to do what I knew needed to be done. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and walked up to his apartment. David opened the door almost as soon as I knocked. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but his smile faltered when he saw the look on my face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "We need to talk," I repeated, my voice shaking slightly. He led me to the couch, and we sat down. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension. I could feel the words lodged in my throat, but they felt too heavy to say. "Claire," David said softly, reaching for my hand. His touch was warm, familiar, and it made my resolve falter for a moment. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." I pulled my hand away, wrapping my arms around myself as if to shield myself from what I was about to do. I took a deep breath. Whatever this is between us, that has to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. David's face hardened. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, anything to change my mind. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said, forcing myself to look him in the eye. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep lying to Jack. It's not fair to him, and it's not fair to me." "Fair?" David's voice was sharp now, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Since when has any of this been about fair? You And Claire, this is real. What we have, it's not some fling. You can't just walk away from it. I have to, I said, my voice breaking. I love my husband. I made a commitment to him, and I've already broken that once. I can't keep betraying him like this. David stood up, pacing the room, his hands raking through his hair. So that's it? You're just going to walk away from us? From what we have? Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. I don't want to hurt you, David, but I can't destroy my marriage. I won't. He stopped pacing, turning to face me. What about us, Claire? What about what we have? You feel it too, I know you do. You can't just pretend this didn't happen. I'm not pretending, I said, my voice trembling. I know it happened.
And it was a mistake.
I got lost in something, and I let it go too far. But I can't let it go any further. David stared at me, his jaw clenched. The silence between us felt suffocating. For a moment, I thought he might explode, might yell, might try to convince me to stay. But instead, he just looked at me with a sadness that cut deeper than any anger could. I don't want to lose you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But if this is what you want, then I won't stand in your way. My heart ached at his words. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to tell him I didn't want to lose him either, that I didn't know how to let him go. But I couldn't. I had already made my decision. I had to end this. I'm sorry, I whispered, standing up. I really am. David didn't say anything else as I walked to the door. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. As I opened the door, I hesitated, my hand resting on the knob for a moment. But then I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. The drive home felt endless. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, sadness. I had done the right thing. I had ended it with David. But why did it feel like a part of me was breaking in the process? When I got home, Jack was in the kitchen making dinner. He smiled when he saw me, his eyes warm and full of love. I walked over to him, wrapping my arms around his waist and burying my face in his chest. Hey, he said softly, surprised by the sudden embrace. You okay? I nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. Yeah, I whispered. I love you. Jack smiled, kissing the top of my head. I love you too. As I stood there in his arms, the weight of everything I had done still hung over me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I had made my choice. Now, I just had to live with it. Even though I had made the decision to end things with David, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was carrying around a broken piece of myself. That night, standing in Jack's arms, I tried to convince myself that everything was going to be okay now. I had chosen my marriage. I had done the right thing. But as the days passed, that hollow ache in my chest wouldn't go away. Jack was trying harder than ever. He was more attentive, more affectionate, making little gestures that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. He would text me during the day, little notes like, "Miss you, can't wait to see you tonight," or "How about we try that new Italian place this weekend?" He was doing everything right, everything I had silently wished for during the months when we had drifted apart. And still, I felt like I was hiding something dark, something that kept me from truly connecting with him. It wasn't just the guilt, it was something deeper. Maybe it was the realization that I had let myself stray so far in the first place. Maybe it was the fear that, even though I had ended things with David, a part of me still craved what he had given me. The weeks turned into a routine of normalcy. Jack and I would have dinner together, watch TV, occasionally go out to meet friends, and on the surface, everything seemed fine. But I could feel the cracks underneath the surface. My mind was constantly fighting itself, half of me trying to immerse myself back into the life I had with Jack, while the other half lingered on memories of David. I hated myself for it, but the feelings didn't just disappear because I wanted them to. One afternoon, a few weeks after I had ended things with David, I ran into him at work. I had been carefully avoiding him, making sure our paths didn't cross. But that day, as I walked to the elevator, there he was, leaning against the wall, checking his phone. The moment our eyes met, my heart leapt into my throat. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to face him again. But there was no way to avoid it now. David straightened up, sliding his phone into his pocket as he walked toward me. Claire. David, I said, my voice betraying the nervousness I felt. For a moment, we stood there, the tension between us thick and unbearable. I didn't know what to say, and the way he was looking at me, like he still wanted me, like nothing had changed, made it even harder to breathe. I wasn't expecting to see you, he said quietly. It's been a while. I've been busy, I replied, shifting uncomfortably. You know, work and everything. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I get it. I've missed you, though. I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar pull of guilt and desire twisting inside me. David, please. We've been over this. He took a step closer, his voice soft but firm. Have we? Because it doesn't feel like it's over to me. I looked away, my hands trembling. It has to be. I can't keep doing this. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know you think you've made the right choice, but can you really say you're happy, Claire? Can you honestly say that everything's fine now, that you're not thinking about me? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right, and I hated that he was right. I wasn't happy. Not completely. I was trying to be, but every time I thought I had things under control, my mind would wander back to him, back to the moments we had shared, the way he made me feel. It was like an addiction I couldn't fully shake. I can't do this, I whispered, my voice breaking. I made my choice. I chose Jack. I love him. I know you do, David said, his voice softer now, almost resigned. But love isn't always enough. What about you, Claire? What about what you want, what you need? I felt tears welling up in my eyes, and I blinked them away quickly. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I don't know what I need anymore. David reached out, gently touching my arm, and even that small gesture sent a shiver down my spine. You don't have to decide right now. But don't lie to yourself. You can't just shut off how you feel. I pulled away from him, my heart racing. I have to go, I said, turning quickly and walking away before he could say anything else. My mind was spinning, and the moment I stepped into the elevator, I felt like I was going to break down. The walls were closing in on me again, and the decision I thought I had made with such finality felt shaky, uncertain. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I threw myself into work, trying to drown out the thoughts that kept creeping in, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get David's words out of my head. That evening, I came home to find Jack already in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He looked up when I walked in, smiling warmly. Hey, you're home early. Yeah, I finished up early, I said, forcing a smile. As I set my bag down and walked over to him, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. Here was my husband, the man who had been nothing but loving and supportive, trying so hard to bring us back to where we used to be. And yet, I couldn't fully give myself to him, not when part of me was still tangled up in everything that had happened with David. We sat down to dinner, and I tried to act normal, tried to engage in conversation, but my mind was elsewhere. Jack noticed. He always noticed. You seem quiet tonight, he said, his eyes searching mine. Is everything okay? I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to spill everything that had been eating away at me. The guilt, the confusion, the feelings I still had for David that I couldn't seem to shake. But how could I do that? How could I look him in the eye and admit that I was still thinking about another man? I'm just tired, I lied, forcing a small smile. It's been a long day. Jack nodded, though his expression remained concerned. He reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. You know I'm here, right? For whatever you need. I know, I whispered, feeling my throat tighten with emotion. Thank you. After dinner, Jack suggested we watch a movie, something light and funny, but I couldn't focus. I sat next to him on the couch, feeling like I was miles away. My mind was a storm of thoughts, all spinning around the same question. What did I really want? The next few days were torture. I kept replaying my conversation with David over and over in my head. He was right. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that I had made the right choice, I couldn't deny that part of me still wanted him. I couldn't deny that he made me feel alive in a way that Jack didn't anymore. But I also couldn't deny that I loved Jack. He was a good man, a steady presence in my life, and the thought of hurting him, of destroying the life we had built together, was unbearable. I was trapped, caught between two worlds, and I didn't know how to find my way out. One evening, as I was driving home from work, my phone buzzed with a text. I glanced at it, expecting it to be Jack, but my heart sank when I saw David's name on the screen. "I can't stop thinking about you. Can we please talk? Just one more time." I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I stared at the message. My mind was screaming at me to delete it, to ignore it, to walk away from this once and for all. But my heart wasn't listening. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a heavy fog. Finally, with shaking hands, I typed out a reply. "Okay, just to talk." As soon as I hit send, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, that I was risking everything, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control, something bigger than me. We agreed to meet the next evening, after work. The entire day, I felt like I was walking in a daze, barely able to focus on anything. My stomach was in knots, my mind racing with a million thoughts, none of them leading me to any clear answers. When I arrived at the cafe where we had agreed to meet, I saw David sitting at a table in the corner, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He smiled softly, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made my heart race. I walked over, my legs feeling shaky, and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of everything we had shared and everything we had ended. Finally, David broke the silence. "I'm glad you came. I don't know why I'm here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't be." David leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "You're here because you feel it too. I know you do. You don't have to keep pretending." "I'm not pretending," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. "I love Jack. I chose him." "I know you love him," David said quietly. "But love isn't always enough. What about you, Claire? What about what you want?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so long trying to make the right choice, trying to be the good wife, that I hadn't allowed myself to really think about what I wanted. And the truth was I didn't know anymore. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know what I want." David reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch was warm, familiar, and it sent a shiver through me. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "But you can't keep living like this. You can't keep lying to yourself." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I blinked them away quickly. He was right, and I hated that he was right. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between two worlds, two men. Something had to give. I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, my voice trembling. "You're already hurting yourself," David said gently. "And if you keep this up, you'll end up hurting Jack too. He deserves to know the truth." My heart clenched painfully in my chest. The truth. The one thing I had been avoiding since this whole mess began. Could I really tell Jack everything? Could I really destroy the life we had built together? David's words echoed in my mind long after we left the cafe that evening. He deserves to know the truth. I knew deep down that he was right. Jack didn't deserve to be kept in the dark, living a life based on lies. But how could I do that to him? How could I look him in the eye and admit that I had betrayed him, that my heart wasn't as loyal as he believed it to be? That night, I drove home in silence, the radio turned off, the city lights blurring through my tears. I felt like I was being torn in two, pulled between the comfort of my marriage with Jack and the unspoken promise of something more with David. The worst part was, I wasn't sure which part of me I trusted anymore. When I walked through the door of our home, Jack was sitting on the couch, his laptop open, his face bathed in the soft glow of the screen. He looked up when I came in and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that broke my heart. He didn't know. He didn't know the storm that was raging inside me. Hey, how was your day? He asked, closing the laptop and setting it aside. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to respond normally. It was fine. Just long. He got up and walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist, pulling me close. You seem tense. Everything okay? I nodded, leaning into his embrace, trying to draw comfort from the familiarity of it. But the guilt was too much. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own lies. Yeah, I whispered, closing my eyes. Just tired. Jack kissed the top of my head and held me a little longer. In that moment, I wanted to tell him everything. The words were right there, hovering on the edge of my lips. But fear kept me silent. Fear of losing him, fear of shattering the life we had built together. So I said nothing. I just let him hold me, wishing I could freeze time and stay in that moment forever. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I could make things work, that I could move past everything that had happened with David and focus on my marriage. Jack was doing everything right. He was attentive, loving, constantly trying to show me how much he cared. He would surprise me with little things, bringing home my favorite wine after a long day, making dinner when I didn't feel like cooking, suggesting we go on weekend getaways to spend more time together. He was trying so hard, and it made me hate myself even more. But no matter how much I tried to focus on Jack, I couldn't shake the thoughts of David. They haunted me, creeping into my mind when I least expected it. I would be at work, staring at my computer screen, and suddenly a memory of David's touch, his kiss, would flood my mind, making my heart race. It was like he had become this constant presence in my life, even when I wasn't with him. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after we met at the cafe, David texted me again. I miss you. I know we said we wouldn't, but can we please meet one more time? Just to talk. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I should do. I should delete the message, ignore it, and move on. But the truth was I missed him too. I missed the way he made me feel, the way he saw me in a way that Jack hadn't for a long time. And despite everything, despite the guilt and the confusion, I wanted to see him again. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I spent the rest of the day in a haze, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted. By the time I got home, I still hadn't made a decision. Jack was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, and when I walked in, he turned and smiled at me, a bottle of wine already open on the counter. I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight, he said, his voice warm and inviting. Just the two of us. I smiled, but it felt hollow. That sounds great. As we sat down to eat, I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over me like a dark cloud. Jack was talking about something that had happened at work, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of David, of the message he had sent me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt was gnawing at me, eating away at whatever was left of my resolve. Jack, I said softly, interrupting him mid-sentence. He looked up, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Yeah. I hesitated, my heart racing. This was it. I could feel the words on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill out. But the fear, the crushing fear of what would happen if I told him the truth, kept me frozen. I just wanted to say thank you, I said, my voice shaky. For everything. For trying so hard lately. Jack smiled, setting his fork down. Of course. I love you, Claire. I just want us to be happy. I love you too, I whispered, feeling the familiar sting of tears in my eyes. I really do. He reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. We're going to be okay, you know? Whatever's been going on, we'll get through it. Together. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that I could somehow put everything that had happened with David behind me and move forward with Jack. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that as long as David was still in my life, even just in my thoughts, I would never be able to fully commit to my marriage. That night, after Jack had fallen asleep, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up in the darkness, and opened David's message again. I miss you. Can we please meet one more time? I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I knew that if I agreed to meet him, there would be no turning back. I would be crossing a line that I couldn't uncross. But the pull was too strong. I couldn't resist it. Okay, tomorrow evening. The moment I hit send, my heart sank. I knew I was making a mistake, but it was like I was caught in a current, unable to stop myself from being pulled deeper into the chaos. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I couldn't focus on anything at work, my mind racing with thoughts of what would happen when I saw David again. I knew it wasn't just going to be a conversation. We had tried that before, and it had never stayed just a conversation. The chemistry between us was too strong, the connection too real. When I arrived at the hotel we had agreed to meet at, my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I knew this was wrong. I knew I was walking into something I might not be able to come back from. But I couldn't stop. David was waiting for me in the lobby. When he saw me, he smiled, that familiar, warm smile that had always made my heart flutter. He stood up and walked over to me, his hand lightly brushing against mine as we made our way to the elevator. Neither of us spoke as we rode up to the room. The tension between us was electric, charged with everything we had been holding back for weeks. When we stepped into the room, the door barely closed behind us before David pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, full of the desire we had both been trying to suppress. I knew I should stop. I knew I should pull away, walk out, go home to Jack. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, losing myself in the heat of the moment, in the way his hands felt on my skin, the way he made me feel alive. We ended up in bed, just like I knew we would. It was reckless, selfish, and wrong, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was the way David made me feel, the way he brought back the spark that had been missing for so long. Afterward, as I lay there beside him, the guilt came crashing down on me, heavier than ever. I had crossed the line again, and this time, I wasn't sure how to come back from it. I had betrayed Jack, not just once, but over and over again, and the realization of what I had done was suffocating. David turned to me, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You don't have to go home tonight," he said softly, his voice filled with something that sounded dangerously close to hope. But I couldn't stay. I knew that much. As much as I had given in to my desires with David, I wasn't ready to walk away from my marriage.
Not yet.
"I have to go," I whispered, sitting up and reaching for my clothes. David didn't try to stop me. He watched in silence as I dressed, his expression unreadable. When I was ready to leave, he stood up and walked me to the door. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said quietly, "but I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait for you." His words made my heart ache. I couldn't respond. Instead, I gave him a small, pained smile and walked out the door. The drive home was torture. The guilt was unbearable, weighing down on me like a physical force. I had done it again. I had betrayed Jack, even after promising myself that I wouldn't. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I stop? When I got home, the house was dark. Jack was already asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long time, watching him sleep peacefully, completely unaware of the storm I was dragging into our lives. As I crawled into bed beside him, the tears finally came. Silent, bitter tears of guilt, regret, and confusion. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to fix this. All I knew was that I was trapped in a mess of my own making, and no matter which way I turned, someone was going to get hurt. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if that someone was going to be Jack or me. The days that followed were some of the darkest I'd ever lived through. Every moment felt heavy, like I was wading through mud, unable to escape the mess I'd created. The guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, refusing to loosen its grip. At home, Jack was as loving as ever, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Every smile, every kind word from him felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into my chest. I didn't deserve his love. I didn't deserve his trust. After that night with David, I had thought maybe I'd feel clearer, maybe I'd find some resolution in the mess of emotions that had consumed me. But instead, I felt more lost than ever. I had been selfish. I'd given in again to the pull of something that was never meant to be, and now I was drowning in the aftermath of my choices. David continued to text me, though I didn't respond. His messages were filled with longing, with promises of a future I couldn't see clearly. But I couldn't give him any answers. I couldn't even give myself answers. Every time my phone buzzed with his name, the weight of my double life became too much to bear. It was a Wednesday evening when everything came crashing down. Jack had come home early from work, surprising me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop, pretending to work, but in truth, I hadn't been able to focus on anything for days. The house was too quiet, my thoughts too loud. "Hey, babe," Jack said, leaning down to kiss the top of my head. "I finished up early. Thought we could cook together tonight. What do you think?" I forced a smile, but it felt thin, fragile. "That sounds nice." As Jack started gathering ingredients, I stood up, walking over to the counter to help him chop vegetables. The silence between us felt comfortable, normal, but inside, I was anything but normal. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of my secrets pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, just as I was chopping a tomato, my phone buzzed on the counter. I froze, my heart stopping as I glanced at the screen. David's name flashed across the screen. Jack was right there. Too close. I reached for the phone, trying to grab it before Jack noticed, but it was too late. He glanced over, noticing the message. "Who's that?" I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone, panic rising in my chest. "Oh, just someone from work," I lied, my voice shaky. But Jack's eyes narrowed, and I could see the shift in his expression. "Claire, what's going on?" My heart pounded in my ears. The guilt, the fear, everything I had been bottling up for so long threatening to spill out. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep lying to him. My voice cracked, and I put down the knife, turning to face him. My hands were trembling, and my chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of everything I had done. Jack's brow furrowed, his expression softening into concern. "Claire, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" Tears welled up in my eyes, and I shook my head, unable to hold back the flood any longer. I haven't been honest with you, Jack." His face fell, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence was unbearable, stretching between us like a chasm that I knew I couldn't cross. "What do you mean?" His voice was quiet, cautious, like he was afraid of what I was about to say. The tears spilled over, and I wiped them away quickly, though it did nothing to stop the sob that broke free from my throat. I've been seeing someone. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I did. Jack stared at me, his face a mix of confusion, disbelief, and hurt. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just standing there, the kitchen suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. "Who?" he finally asked, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. I couldn't look him in the eye. I stared down at the floor, my heart breaking. "His name is David. Someone I work with." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack stepped back, as if the words physically hit him, his hands trembling as they reached for the counter to steady himself. I could see the pain in his eyes, the shock that was quickly turning into something much darker, betrayal. "How long?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "A few months." Jack's face twisted with a mixture of anger and grief. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen as if he didn't know what to do with himself. "A few months? Claire, how could you?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't defend myself. I had done the unthinkable, and now I had to face the consequences. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though the words felt hollow, useless. "I didn't want this to happen.
I didn't mean for it to."
Jack let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't mean to destroy our marriage? To throw everything we've built away for some guy?" Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't stop them. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I've been so lost, Jack. I didn't feel alive. And I'm so sorry Alive, he interrupted, his voice rising with anger. So what, Claire? I wasn't enough for you? Our life wasn't enough. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. He was right. In the end, I had been selfish. I had let my feelings, my dissatisfaction with life, drive me into someone else's arms, and now I was standing in the wreckage of everything we had built together. Jack looked away, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with pain. I can't do this, he muttered, more to himself than to me. He grabbed his coat from the chair and started toward the door. Jack, please, I sobbed, following him, my heart breaking with every step he took. Don't leave. Please, let's talk about this. I love you. He turned back, his eyes cold, distant in a way I had never seen before. Love? You say you love me, but you didn't think about that when you were with him, did you? I flinched at the words, my guilt twisting deeper, but I couldn't stop myself. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. But I don't want to lose you. Please, Jack, I'll do anything to fix this. I'll end it with him, I swear. Jack shook his head, his expression full of disbelief. End it? Claire, it should have never started. I don't even know who you are anymore. With that, he walked out the door, slamming it behind him, leaving me standing there, my body shaking with sobs, the sound of my world collapsing around me. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, my mind reeling, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Jack was gone. My marriage was hanging by a thread, and I had no idea if it could be salvaged. The house felt empty, too quiet without him. I sat down on the couch, curling into myself, the tears still flowing freely. I had destroyed everything. Everything I had with Jack, everything we had built together. And for what? For a fleeting sense of excitement, for a thrill that had left me feeling hollow and broken in the end. I reached for my phone, the screen still lit with David's message from earlier. My heart sank as I stared at it. I had thought he was what I needed, that he could somehow fill the void I had felt in my life. But now I realized the truth. The void wasn't something David could fill. It wasn't something Jack could fix either. It was something inside me, something I hadn't faced, hadn't acknowledged. I deleted David's message without responding. It was over. It had to be. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had destroyed my marriage, my relationship with Jack, and now I had to live with the consequences. There was no going back, no undoing what I had done. Jack didn't come home that night. I didn't know where he had gone, and I didn't have the strength to call him. All I could do was sit there, alone in the dark, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. The next few days passed in a blur. Jack stayed away, and I was left to confront the full weight of my actions. I couldn't escape the guilt, the regret, the pain of knowing that I had destroyed the one thing that had mattered most to me, my marriage. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. Eventually, Jack came home, but things were different. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the silence more painful than any argument we could have had. He stayed in the guest room, barely speaking to me, his eyes full of hurt every time they met mine. I tried to apologize, tried to explain, but nothing I said could erase what I had done. The trust we had once shared was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. Months passed, and though we tried to repair the damage, things were never the same. Jack had changed. I had changed. The foundation of our marriage had cracked, and no matter how hard we tried to patch it up, the cracks remained, visible in every conversation, every glance. In the end, Jack couldn't forgive me. He moved out and we filed for divorce. It was the hardest thing I'd ever gone through, watching the man I had loved walk away from me, knowing that I was the one who had pushed him away. As I packed up our home, the memories of our life together flooded back. Our wedding day, the trips we'd taken, the nights spent laughing and talking like nothing else in the world mattered. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who wasn't broken, someone who hadn't made the mistakes I had made. I thought about David sometimes, wondering if I had made the right decision by cutting him out of my life. But I knew that no matter what, it wouldn't have worked. My heart had never truly belonged to him. It had always been Jack's, even if I hadn't realized it in time to save us. In the end, I was left alone, picking up the pieces of a life I had shattered with my own hands. The price of betrayal was steep, and I paid for it every day. And now, all that's left are the regrets, the memories of a love I destroyed, and the man I lost forever.